Kings and Queens of Swift. We're going to build a Game of Thrones app to access all 444 houses of Westeros. This is posted as an exam review for my students in their Zero to Full Stack programming course. This is an actual midterm during a prior semester after about 11 weeks of classes, and although many of my students in class have never taken a programming class before, we've covered a lot of ground. So this midterm covers table views, API access with URL session, JSON parsing in Swift, working with multiple view controllers, segues and passing data between view controllers, animation, gestures, sound, standard Swift concepts and UI elements like images, fonts, text, numbers, arrays, showing and hiding interface objects, constraints and auto resizing, and custom classes and structs. If you want to follow along with a semester-long course content that our students have completed prior to this exam, you can find it all at bit.ly/prof-g-swift. All lowercase letters. Now this is what we're going to build. A logo floats up from the bottom of the splash screen. A few seconds of the Game of Thrones theme plays. If these are clicks before the theme is done, the theme stops playing, and a click on an image also segues to a table view that loads the first 50 Westeros house names in alphabetical order, numbering them as well. Clicking on a house presents a detail page with more information, including, if available, the house motto or words, the region that house is from, a map of that region, and, if available, information on their sigil or coat of arms. Also, if you keep scrolling, every time we get to the end of the current number of houses that we've loaded, 50 more will load up until we reach all 444 Westeros houses. House Greyjoy might not so, but your house sure can Swift. Valor Code Gulas. Any employers watching this know that my students are smart, hard workers, and don't shrink from a challenge. Reach out if you're hiring, and I'll be happy to pass on any recruiting information to them. Let's code. So my exams always have a goofy intro, but to be clear, this is a closed book exam, only one double-sided 8.5-inch by 11-inch page of notes. Students can't access older apps or code, except for any code examples they can fit on their single sheet of notes. They have 2.5 hours to complete the exam in class on their Macs. There's a lot of brain sweat happening. Now in this exam, we access an API of Ice and Fire. It's a public API with Game of Thrones data. We'll access only a small portion to demonstrate mastery or mastery of key concepts, and you've already seen a demo of what the final app will look like. Now, I do ask questions step by step, letting students know what's expected of them so they can get partial credit. It also helps them do as much as possible in a 2.5-hour exam. It makes up for the fact that in a professional setting, you might be able to look things up, but I also want them to have mastery of concepts because they're not going to be able to look things up in a code interview. And I do give them explicit names for things like data structures, functions, and outlets to make it easier to grade a large class of students. Otherwise, I might have all sorts of wild names and different conventions that I'd need to sift through. And that's also good practice for industry, where you'll usually have to conform for some kind of organizational programming guidelines. Now I have some resources for my students at this URL, bit.ly/swiftygot, capital S, capital G, and capital T. There are a bunch of map images and sounds that you'll need to complete the app. Also an icon set. Students usually want to install their app on the device after they take the exam. It's fun to teach a class where the students want to show off their homework. So just highlight them all, right-click, select download, give your file a name. Google will zip up the files. I'll save mine to the desktop. If your browser doesn't ask you where to save, then it's probably going to save them to the downloads folder. And then you can start up Xcode because we're ready to create our project. Select Create New Project. This is going to be a single view app. Click Next. Let's give it the name GOT Houses. Now at this point in the course, we haven't covered any Swift UI, so make sure that your user interface says Storyboard. Click Next. I'm going to save mine right to the desktop. I'll double click the title bar to expand Xcode to full screen. Then I'm going to head over to the Finder and I'm going to double click on my zip file that I downloaded from Google. Now when I saved my local file, it created a file called GOT-files. That's what I saved it. If you named it something different, you'd have a different name. But after double clicking, I've got this other folder here that has the same name as my zip file, but it's a folder, GOT files. I'm going to double click to open that and select everything inside of it. Then back in Xcode, I'm going to click on the assets catalog. That's assets.xc assets. And as usual for a new Xcode project, the only thing in the assets catalog is an empty icon set. I actually have an icon set in the files that you downloaded from Google. So I'm going to right click on this app icon set here, then select delete selected items. And then I'm going to go back to the Finder with all of my files selected. I'm going to drag them all into my assets catalog. And right at the top, you see the stylish Iron Throne icon set. And if you highlight and move your cursor down through these files, you can see the different regional maps of the regions of Westeros. And let's see, I've got a file in here called URL to copy. You don't need that, so I'm going to highlight that and just press the delete key. Then let's follow along with the exam. Now, while I have students set constraints and use auto resizing, just in case they run into some trouble, I suggest everybody design on an iPhone 11 Pro profile. The first step is to embed the view controller in a navigation controller. So click on Main Storyboard in your project navigator, then click on the view controller on the yellow ball inside of the dock, and then go up under the Edit menu, embed in Navigation Controller. Boom, the navigation controller is added to the left. Next, add a table view. Refer to the table view in your code as table view, lower camel case. Add 4 constraints for the table view. Top, left, right, and bottom. 0 points away from the safe area. So I'll head back into Xcode. In the main storyboard, I'll click on the library, search for a table view, drag the table view over, let go on my view controller, then add constraints 0, 0, 0, 0, top, left, right, and bottom. Click on add 4 constraints. Table view now stretches out to the edges of the safe area. Then I'm going to click on the view controller and option click on main storyboard to get into the assistant editor mode. And I'm going to control drag over from my table view to create a new IB outlet, and I'll call that table view lower camel case. Then I'll click this X to get out of assistant editor mode. And back in the exam, the next thing we want to do is to create a table view cell, set the style to basic, set the table view cells identifier to capital C, lowercase ell, and set the table view selection attribute to none so that the gray selection indicator will not show up when the cell is selected. So back in Xcode, I'll click the plus sign to bring up the library, search for table view and select the table view cell, then drag that over right on top of my table view. Make sure that you're in the attribute inspector. For identifier, type capital C, lowercase ell. For style, I'm going to select basic. And for selection, I'm going to select none. And then I want my students to set the title label inside of the basic cell attribute to Papyrus. This semester, students have not only done this, but they've also worked with custom table view cells and collection view cells, so you probably wouldn't have had this coaching on the right. So back in Xcode, you might want to use the document outline to make sure that you dig into the cell and then the content view, and then you see the title in there with the L next to it to indicate that it's a label. Then you can go up under the Attributes Inspector, select the little T next to Font, switch from System Font to Custom, click on the font family. If you type P, you'll jump right down to where the P fonts are. I'm going to select Papyrus, then Done, and let's return to the exam. And up next, let's create a string array named houses that will hold sample house names to be used just so that we can make sure that our table view works. We're eventually going to replace this, so this is just to check our interface at this point. Do everything you need to do to get your table view up, displaying that string array inside of houses. Be sure to put any code related to the table view inside of an extension. If you build and run your project at this point, you should see something that looks like the image on the right, assuming those are the 4 names that you added into your houses array. So back in Xcode, click on viewcontroller.swift, and we're going to add right under our IB outlet a variable var houses equals, it's an array, so make sure that you've got square brackets, and then we'll put 4 strings in there for house names. How about Stark, comma Lannister, comma Targaryen, comma Greyjoy, and since those are all strings, they've got to be in double quotes. Then for the code for our table view, we've already got our IB outlet for the table view, but in view did load, always think delegate data source, delegate data source. So in view did load, we'll say table view.delegate equals self, table view.data source equals self. Then we'll go down here and add the extension. The extension is for this class here called view controller, so I'll copy and paste this down below. Colon, again, delegate data source, delegate data source. So if we type in table view delegate, and I can select UI table view delegate, return, comma, and then I'll put in table view data source, select UI table view data source, return, open and close curlies. Xcode thinks for a little bit, takes a look at these protocols and says, hey, you need some functions to use these protocols. Do you want to add the protocol stubs? Xcode, stub me. Click that fix. So Xcode gives us an outline for these 2 functions that we need for using these table view protocols. Specifically, they're for the table view data source protocol. The first one returns an int, so we want to return the count of the array that we're using to populate our table view cells. That's houses up here. I'll copy this, and down below, I'll say return houses.count. And the second one, we're going to return a cell that we set up every time Xcode needs to set up a new cell. So we'll say let cell equals tableview.dequeue reusable cell. This allows iOS to recycle any table view cells that your app has already created. We've got a couple options for dequeue reusable cell. We want to select the one with identifier, which is a string, and for index path. For the string, which is our identifier string, so between the double quotes, capital C, lowercase ell. For the index path, it's just the index path that we have being passed in as the call to the function. So we'll put in index path, lower camel case. Tip for students: as you work on your exam, you might want to make double sure that your identifier string in your code matches the identifier that you typed in your table view cell in the attributes inspector. I've seen students accidentally add an extra space or get the capitalization wrong between what's in their code and what's on the storyboard. Some developers call these strings magic strings. They're actually terrible strings. It's one of the places where Xcode can't tell if you've entered a mistake. So I'm hopeful in some future version of Xcode there'll be a facility to be able to write the string once and map it between your code and your attribute inspector, but right now just be careful to identify your strings and that the same strings match your code in your storyboard. Copying and pasting is always a good thing to do. So back in viewcontroller.swift, remember this function returns a UI table view cell, so we have to say return cell, the cell we just created. Then between let cell where we create our cell and return cell when we return it, let's configure that cell, put the data that we want to display in the table view cell, so we'll say cell dot text label, and this text label is the one that's built into the basic cell style that we selected on the storyboard. Put in a question mark here. If you didn't, Xcode would remind you that you need a question mark in here. Then say dot text equals houses, which is our array, bracket index path. Remember, you always need the dot row in there to get the index value of the element that we want to show. But that's it. If we go ahead and build and run, I'll build mine on an iPhone 11 Pro, and we should see exactly what we're expecting. No errors. Build succeeded. Hammer time. And here it is. Perfect. Nice work. Basic table view skills demonstrated. So next up, thinking MVC, we're going to work on the model. We're going to create a house info struct and a houses class with an array of house info objects. So create a Swift file named houseinfo.swift. It'll be a custom struct named houseinfo and add the following 4 properties to the houseinfo struct. They should all be strings. They should be named name, region, coat of arms, and words. So back in Xcode, I like my models to be right underneath the screen delegate, so I'll right-click on that, select new file. This is going to be a Swift file because we're not subclassing one of Apple's classes. We're going to call this houseinfo upper camel case because a custom struct is going to be a type. Click create, click finish, and we define this struct with struct houseinfo upper camel case open and close curlies. And then our 4 properties are var name colon string, var region colon string, var coat of arms lower camel case colon string, var words colon string. And then back to the exam. Question 3 is create a Swift file named houses.swift and use it for a custom class named houses. So I'll right click on house info, new file, Swift file, name it houses, upper camel case, create, finish. Then we say class houses upper camel case open and close curlies. And back to the exam. Question number 4 says add the following 3 properties to the houses class: house array, which is an array of house info initialized as an empty array, URL, which is a string initialized to the value below, page number, which is an int which has an initial value of 1, and in that house array that holds house info, each table view cell will show the house name. That URL value is going to be the URL to start access at an API of Ice and Fire. That's the service that delivers all the Game of Thrones data to us. And page number will be changed eventually, and that will keep track of how many pages of house data, 50 houses per page, we've gathered from the service. So first up, declare house array. So we'll say var house array lower camel case colon open bracket house info upper camel case close bracket equals open bracket close bracket. Then our URL property var URL equals, and then in between quotes, I'm going to paste in the API from the exam, then var page number equals 1. Next up is question 5 in viewcontroller.swift. Change the variable houses from a string array and instead declare it as an instance of the houses class, and then modify the code in the extension so that it works with a houses object that we just created and refers to the house array property of this houses object. Then put the name property of each house array element displayed in the cell. Now if we run it at this point, we're not going to see anything in the table view cells, but at least it'll build and run without any errors. So back in viewcontroller.swift, I'm going to comment out this houses variable that was just an array of strings, and I'll replace that with a new houses variable, and I'll make sure that I initialize this as well. So that's var lowercase houses equals upper camel case houses with open and close parentheses. Then any place in our extension where we had previously referred to just houses, which was our string array, we want to now refer to houses.houseArray. So that's what we'll do in number of rows in section. And then down here in cell for row at, we'll replace houses with houses.houseArray. But we also have to make sure we're going to return a string here because we've got to put a string into the text attribute of our text label. And that's going to be .name for the name of the house. And we'll do a quick build and run. We've got no data in here, so we see an empty table, but we have no errors, so everything's looking good. By the way, just a quick heads up, this video was recorded 2 days after the release of Xcode 11.4, and in this release, the simulator now has a title bar above each simulated iOS device. So let me show you what happens if you click on the red traffic light. It's the equivalent of quitting the app's execution in the simulator, and if you do this, oftentimes you'll crash in appdelegate.swift, and you'll be returned to the debug navigator. Now, there's nothing wrong with your app, you just crashed Xcode's ability to run debugging tools on an app that's no longer in the simulator because you just quit out of it by clicking on that little red traffic light, but you can easily return to your files by clicking on the project navigator. So all right, let's return to the exam and get a list of houses and display the names in the table view cells. So right here on the exam, I show you the JSON that you will see in the first house and a little bit of the second house if you go to this URL. But why don't we highlight this URL, copy it, head over to our browser, paste in this URL, and take a look at the JSON. And this is an API of Ice and Fire. It's got all this Game of Thrones information. We happen to be in the houses area right here. We can see that there's a lot of different stuff like name and region and coat of arms and words, which is exactly the data we want to keep track of in house info. So what we want to do in houses.swift is write a get data method, and we've done this before in WeatherGift and in our Pokédex project, and we want to use get data to get house info data for all of the houses returned by the URL. So the first time we go through this, we're going to get data on the first 50 houses. We won't worry about the other pages yet, but we'll cover that before we're done with the exam. Now the hints down here suggest that it's always a good thing to print out the JSON to the console just to make sure that you're getting the right things from your API call. You can also print out each individual element of house array if you're not getting the results you expect and you want to inspect every individual element in the array. But once we get the data that we want, we'll modify the table view code so that the cells show a number before each house name beginning with 1, and when the code is working, it should look like the screenshot that you see at the right. So let's head back to our code, and we've been using a pretty generic and reusable get data function. So why don't we actually head over to our Pokemon project and take a look at how we wrote a get data method there to access JSON. So inside the Pokemon project, I'm going to take a look at Pokemon data.swift. We see our get data function here. This class, Pokemon data, also has a URL variable. That variable is used inside of the get data function. And to show you how reusable and generic the code we've already written is, I'm going to highlight this whole get data function, copy it with a Command C, then head back into my Game of Thrones houses project, go back to houses.swift, and paste it in right after my properties. Now, in terms of the reusability of this code, I'm going to cut out everything that's specific to the previous application, and that's just these 3 lines in the do, try, catch loop right after the try and before the catch. Now, for my students, everything that you see in get data now would be a great thing to put in your notes, because if you set up a private struct named returned, it's structured just like the JSON that you're getting through the API call, then at this point, return should have the JSON that you want, and you can just go through and parse it as you need it. Now, get data works for both the Game of Thrones houses class and the Pokemon data class. The get data function in both of these classes take a URL string from the URL property of the class, and both of those classes have a URL property. Look, we've got the same thing back in our Pokemon data class. We've already seen in our WeatherGift lesson that you can swap out URLs and use the same get data code to get data from different APIs. Remember, when we first got our WeatherGift data, we swapped out the WeatherGift URL for the Pokemon URL and we got Pokemon data. Well, same thing here, but there is a notable difference between the way that the Pokemon data is structured and the Game of Thrones houses data is structured. And just to take a look at that, to drive the point home, what I'm going to do is go back into my Pokemon project. I'm going to copy the Pokemon URL, and I'm going to put the Pokemon JSON in a tab right next to my Game of Thrones JSON. Now in our Pokemon data, we get count, which is an int, and next, which is a string, it's a URL, and results. And now results is an array. Now remember how we've been parsing JSON in Swift. We parse JSON with a private struct that's structured with the same names as our JSON keys and with the same types as the JSON values for those keys. Now each element in a results array has 2 properties. It's got a string name and a string name URL. So we see in Pokemon data, we created a private struct named returned. Now the properties need to be named the same thing as the JSON, but we could call the struct anything we want. Returned is a good name. And returned, this private codable struct that has to match up with the JSON, has the same three properties that we find in our JSON: count, next, and results. And results is an array of type Pokemon. And if we look at Pokemon, we see first that it's codable. Anything that parses or decodes JSON needs to be codable. And it contains those two properties, name and URL, just like each element of the array that we see inside of the key named results. Let's take a look at our Game of Thrones data, and there's an important difference. The Pokemon data had an array one level in, so we first go to this key results, which is the array. But Game of Thrones is an array right away. See, it starts with these square brackets, and then there are elements right after the square brackets. There's no key name for this array. The array just starts up right away. So let me show you how we can go ahead and grab data that starts out as an array. So I'm going to show you a couple of techniques, hopefully building off what you've already worked with. Now, we could create a return struct similar to our Pokemon return data and use that, and we'll start there because that's the most familiar technique you've used, but there's an even more efficient way. But first, let's go ahead and work with the return struct. So just like in Pokemon data, I'm going to say private struct returned, and it's going to be codable, open and close curlies, and now this is going to be the stuff that's going to be specific to the Game of Thrones JSON. Now the tricky part is handling the array that starts off right away in the Game of Thrones data, but we know we want to keep track of a variable name, which is a string, a variable region, which is a string, a variable coat of arms, which is a string, and a variable words, which is a string. And you want to make absolutely 100% sure that all of your variable names are spelled and capitalized exactly as they appear in your JSON. So coat of arms here, spelled lower camel case, it's the same way in our JSON. So if we scroll down to our try statement, there's actually an error in here, and I'm going to leave the error in for my build and run. The error is easy to make, and hopefully by making this error and then talking about it, it'll help you understand your code a little bit better. So my comment says, guess why this won't work? And we'll say print, triple star, so we recognize where this is in our console. This is what we return from get data, string interp with returned inside. Now I option click on top of returned and let's see what it is. Oh, it says that it's of type returned. If I scroll up here, I see, oh yeah, there's a type returned. I see all the stuff that's inside of it. But when you think about this, we don't just want to get returned, because returned would just give me name, region, coat of arms, and words. What we want is an array of returned. So let's go ahead and run this and get our error. First, let's head over to viewcontroller.swift. And remember, we've got to call houses.getData. For now, all we care about is what comes up in the console, so I'll put a to-do in here to say update table view here. And I can get rid of this old commented out houses string array. Back to houses.swift, build and run, and here's our error. It says JSON error, the data couldn't be read because it isn't in the correct format. So the reason why you get this is because you are trying to decode data into a data structure that's this first parameter after decode in the parentheses here that doesn't match the JSON that we see on the web. So for us, we have returned, and returned is a single returned data structure, but what we want is an array of returned. That's why we got the error. Well, hey, how do we get an array of returned instead of a just straight up returned? Well, let me show you. Take a look at what's after the try statement here. This is where we go ahead and we use the JSON decoder. And when we say decode inside of a returned.self, that means, hey, we're planning on decoding something which is a single instance of returned. Well, what if we put brackets around returned? Then we're saying, hey, what we decode, we expect that to be an array of returned. This changes the game entirely. Build and run now, champions, and look at that. You ought to be named the ladies and lords of Westeros because you have JSON showing up in your console. This worked. So again, we learned something really important about matching the data that we try to decode. We need to make sure that it's in the exact same format. If the first thing we're getting is an array, we've got to make sure that we're decoding to an array of that struct, so we got to use the square brackets. Now I also promised that we could do things a little bit more efficiently. Take a look at this struct here. We've got name, region, coat of arms, and words. I'm going to highlight it and then command / to comment this all out because we already have a struct with all of these properties. It's our house info struct. And this house array property inside of our houses class is already an array of house info. Let's go take a look at house info. Well, will you look at that? The only difference between this bad boy and our return struct was this one isn't codable. Well, we can change that. we'll just say colon codable, and now of course the name is different. It's not called returned, it's called house info. We'll keep house info, head back over here to houses.swift, and we're going to do two things to our try line down here. One is, instead of creating a constant called returned, why don't we decode directly into self.houseArray? We can do that, but we've also got to go in here and instead of decoding an array of returned, we're going to decode an array of house info. And just make sure in your print statement that you swap out returned for self.houseArray. Now, the primary reason we use those private structs in the previous access of JSON is we needed to create data structures that reflected the JSON that we saw on the web, but that wasn't necessarily in the format that we wanted in our own app. In the previous examples, the JSON was layered, it was nested, it was in several layers deep. And frankly, that's usually the case. You'll usually have this nested JSON, and what you need to do is you need to decode it into a flatter structure. You'll face JSON, which is layered, it's nested, there are components inside of components, but here we're fortunate enough to have JSON that's structured nice and flat, non-nested, exactly like the data structures we're going to be using in our app. So that's why we don't need the private structs here. If you kept them in and they still worked, no problem, but we can make our code even more efficient in the way you just learned. So let's go ahead and build and run. We see the exact same results we had before. Outstanding. Now it's time to put this data inside of our array and show it in our table view. That's going to be pretty easy to do. First, I'll clear out these comments in my houses class that I don't need anymore. This next question wants us to modify the table view code so that the cells show a number before each house name beginning with 1. All we need to do to make that happen is to head over to viewcontroller.swift. Remember, we put a little to-do comment in here and that shows up in the jump bar. We'll just delete this. We'll say self.tableview.reload data. Now, I forgot to do something really important in here, and you'll see it'll produce an error. I'll fast forward the video so you won't have to struggle through the error on your own, but maybe you know what I'm missing here. I've already seen this error a couple of times, and it's really common to make. That's why I keep them in here. But before we build and run, let's go down here into cell for row at. Remember, we want a number to show up before the house name. So I'll highlight this code after the equal sign that shows the house name, cut it out with the command X, then put in double quotes, string interp, period, space, string interp. In the second string interp, I'll paste in what I just cut out. That'll give me my name. In that first string interp, you want indexPath.row +1. The +1 is important because you're 0 indexed. If you want to start counting by 1, you need to +1. Then I build and run, gak, it's a crash, it's that purple error. You know how to solve this purple error. This is because we're accessing data on another queue, but when we do anything with the user interface, we need to do it on the main queue. So we just need to put in dispatch queue .main.async, open and close curlies. Then we can cut out our self.tableview.reload, paste it in between those curlies, build and run again, and this looks magnificent. Excellent job, Swifter. We'll take a break for now. The next video will show you how we can get more detail on each of these houses in another view controller. But I think that you're ready for the Iron Throne, or at least be knighted based on your Swift skills. Keep at it, Swifter.